The setting sun painted the Montana sky in hues of amber and gold as the train pulled into Millbrook Station. Among the few passengers disembarking stood Katerina Petrova, clutching a worn leather suitcase and a letter promising a new beginning. At 28, she had been told her prospects for marriage in her village had withered like autumn leaves. Now, thousands of miles from her homeland, she wondered if the American West would see her any differently. Little did she know that the silver-haired rancher waiting reluctantly on the platform would come to see in her something no one else ever had. Not a burden, not damaged goods, but the perfect match his wounded heart had been waiting for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The platform at Millbrook Station had seen better days. These say wooden planks creaked under Katerina's weight as she stepped off the train, her eyes squinting against the dust kicked up by the departing locomotive. She smoothed down her best dress, now wrinkled from 3 days of travel, and scanned the sparse crowd for someone who might be looking for her. Katerina wasn't naive. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. A mail-order bride who had crossed oceans because no man in her village would have her. Too old, her mother's friends had whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Almost 30 and unmarried. There must be something wrong with her. The words had stung more than she cared to admit. The letter from Martha Wilson had been unexpected. The elderly housekeeper for a Montana rancher named Emmett Sullivan had written on her employer's behalf, though later Katerina would learn Emmett had known nothing about it. Martha's letter had been kind, describing a beautiful ranch nestled against mountain foothills, with wildflowers in spring and golden grasses in autumn. She mentioned nothing about the ranch's financial troubles, or about Emmett's grief-hardened heart. Miss Petrova. The voice belonged to a stern-faced woman. In her 70s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Martha Wilson's appearance matched her practical handwriting, but her eyes held a warmth her posture denied. "I'm Martha Wilson. Mr. Sullivan sent me to fetch you." This wasn't entirely true. Emmett Sullivan had grudgingly agreed to drive Martha to the station after she'd finally confessed what she'd done, but he'd refused to leave the wagon. "I won't be part of this foolishness," he'd declared, his voice gruff from disuse. "Bring her back if you must, but don't expect me to welcome her." Katerina followed Martha to where a weathered farm wagon waited, a silver-haired man at the reins. Emmett Sullivan didn't dismount to help her with her luggage, nor did he offer a greeting. His eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, barely glanced her way before returning to the horizon. The deep lines etched around his mouth spoke of years spent in the harsh Montana sun, but also of a smile long abandoned. "This is her." He directed the question to Martha, as if Katerina weren't standing right there. "This is Miss Katerina Petrova," Martha replied, a hint of reproach in her tone. "From Europe, just as I told you. She's older than you said." His assessment wasn't cruel, merely factual, but Katerina felt the familiar sting nonetheless. "I am 28, Katerina said, her accent thick, but her English clear enough. "I can work hard. I am not afraid." Something in her direct gaze made Emmett pause. He'd expected tears, perhaps, or pleading. Instead, this foreign woman with her amber eyes and determined chin looked at him not as a savior, but as an equal. He grunted and nodded toward the back of the wagon. The journey to Sullivan Ranch passed in silence. Katerina watched the landscape unfold, so different from her homeland with its dense forests and close-set villages. Here, the land stretched endlessly, the mountains a distant promise against the sky. Occasionally, Martha would point out a landmark or name a plant Katerina had never seen before. Emmett kept his eyes on the road, but his mind wandered to the letter he'd found in Martha's apron pocket weeks ago. "A companion for your golden years," the advertisement had promised. When confronted, Martha had been unapologetic. "7 years since Sarah passed, and this house needs life again," she'd said. "Besides, the girl needs a home, and you need someone to leave this place to when your time comes." Sullivan Ranch appeared first as a cluster of buildings against the foothills, a 2-story farmhouse weathered by time, a large barn with a slight lean to its frame, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. A creek cutting through the property caught the late afternoon light, glinting like scattered coins. Despite its obvious struggles, the ranch held a raw beauty that made Katerina catch her breath. "It's not much," Emmett said, mistaking her wonder for disappointment. "Drought's been hard on everyone." "It is more than I expected," Katerina replied honestly. In her village, even the wealthiest farmer owned less land than what stretched before her now. The farmhouse kitchen was warm, filled with the aroma of Martha's cooking. The elderly housekeeper showed Katerina to a small bedroom off the main hall, clearly prepared with care, its window overlooking the creek and mountains beyond. The bed was covered with a handmade quilt, and wildflowers stood in a jar on the bedside table. "I'll leave you to settle in," Martha said. "Supper's in an hour. Don't mind Mr. Sullivan's gruffness. His bark is worse than his bite." Left alone, Katerina unpacked her few belongings, some clothes, a small wooden box containing her mother's amber necklace, and the tools of her trade, needles, thread, and patterns for the intricate weaving her family had practiced for generations. She changed into a simpler dress and splashed water on her face, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman who looked back at her seemed different somehow. The same amber eyes and dark hair, the same small scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood fall, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion from the journey, or perhaps it was the first tendrils of hope taking root. Supper was a quiet affair. Emmett spoke little, answering Katerina's polite questions about the ranch with the fewest words possible. Martha tried to fill the silence, chattering about the town, the neighbors, the church picnic coming up on Sunday. Victor Caldwell stopped by again today, Martha mentioned casually, though the tightening of Emmett's jaw suggested the topic was anything but casual. "That man can stop by every day for the next century." "My answer won't change," Emmett growled, his first complete sentence of the evening. Katerina looked between them, curious but unwilling to pry. Later, Martha explained in hushed tones that Victor Caldwell was the wealthiest man in the county, gradually buying up struggling ranches to expand his empire. He'd been trying to purchase Sullivan Ranch for years, his offers growing as Emmett's fortunes declined. "The ranch has been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations, Martha explained. "Emmett would sooner die than sell it, even though it's breaking his back to keep it going. His son Daniel left for the city years ago. Couldn't stand the hard life out here. Now it's just Emmett and a couple of hired hands who come by when he can afford them." In the following days, Katerina fell into the rhythm of ranch life. She rose before dawn to help Martha with breakfast, then spent the mornings learning about American cooking, cleaning, and laundry, similar to what she'd known back home, but with different tools and methods. In the afternoons, she explored the property, gathering plants she recognized for dyes and medicines, sketching ideas for new weaving patterns inspired by the landscape. Emmett watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He spent his days mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle, and worrying about the lack of rain. The drought had stretched on longer than anyone could remember, turning the nearby creek to a trickle and withering what should have been lush grazing land. On the 5th day, Katerina ventured into town with Martha to purchase supplies. Milbrook consisted of little more than a main street lined with essential businesses. A general store, a small bank, a saloon, and the white-clappered church where most of the 300 residents gathered on Sundays. The stares began the moment they stepped into Whitman's general store. Women whispered behind gloved hands, and men eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and something more unsettling. Eleanor Whitman, a thin woman with pinched features, barely concealed her disdain as Martha introduced Katerina. "So this is the mail-order bride," Eleanor said, looking Katerina up and down. "Older than I expected. Most men want them young enough to bear plenty of children." Katerina's cheeks burned, but she held her head high. "I am here to be Mr. Sullivan's companion, not a broodmare." Martha unsuccessfully tried to hide her smile behind a cough, while Eleanor's eyes widened at Katerina's directness. Before the storekeeper could respond, the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Victor Caldwell cut an impressive figure. Tall, well-dressed, with the confident air of a man accustomed to getting his way. His dark hair was touched with distinguished grey at the temples, his moustache neatly trimmed. His eyes, cold as river, stones, fixed on Katerina with immediate interest. "Well, well," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "You must be the European woman staying with old Sullivan. The gossip mill's been working overtime since you arrived. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Mr. Caldwell," Martha acknowledged stiffly. "We were just finishing our shopping." "No need to rush on my account, Mrs. Wilson." Victor stepped closer to Katerina, studying her as one might examine a horse for purchase. "I'm Victor Caldwell, the largest landowner in the county. And you are?" "Katerina Petrova." She did not offer her hand, something in his demeanor setting her on edge. "Miss Petrova." He smiled without warmth. "You've chosen an interesting time to come to Milbrook. Poor Sullivan's ranch is barely hanging on. One more season without rain, and he'll have no choice but to sell. Perhaps you'd be better off reconsidering your arrangement." "Mr. Sullivan has been very kind to me," Katerina replied carefully. Victor laughed, the sound lacking any real humor. "Emmett Sullivan hasn't been kind to anyone since his wife died. Don't fool yourself, Miss Petrova. You're a business transaction to him, nothing more." Martha stepped between them, her elderly frame suddenly steel. "That's quite enough, Mr. Caldwell. Katerina, we should head back now." As they left the store, Eleanor Whitman's voice carried clearly. "What does a man like Emmett Sullivan want with a foreign woman pushing 30? Must be desperate indeed." The wagon ride home was silent until they reached the outskirts of town. Then Martha sighed heavily. "Don't let them bother you, child. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal." "It's not the first time I've heard such things," Katerina said quietly. "In my village they said worse. At least here, no one knows about my past." Martha patted her hand but didn't pry. Everyone had stories they preferred to keep buried. That was one thing the American West and Eastern Europe apparently had in common. When they returned to the ranch, they found Emmett in the yard, engaged in a heated argument with a young man Katerina hadn't seen before. The family resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong jaw, the same pale blue eyes, though the younger man's hair was dark instead of silver. "You're running this place into the ground out of sheer stubbornness," the young man was saying. "Caldwell's offer is more than fair, and you know it." "I didn't ask for your opinion, Daniel," Emmett replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "You gave up any right to decide the fate of this ranch when you walked away." Daniel Sullivan noticed the wagon then, his angry gaze shifting to Katerina. "Is this her, your mail-order bride?" He spat the last words like a curse. "Godfather, have you really sunk this low? She's practically an old maid." Katerina felt each word like a physical blow, but before she could speak, Emmett stepped forward, putting himself between her and his son. "You will show Miss Petrova respect in my house," he said, each word precise and cutting. "She's a guest here." Daniel laughed bitterly. A guest? Is that what we're calling it? Caldwell told me all about it, how desperate you must be to send. Away for a woman, and not even a young one, who could give you heirs for this worthless piece of land. That's enough! For the first time, Emmett raised his voice. Get off my property, Daniel. Don't come back until you can behave like the man I tried to raise you to be. After Daniel stormed off, an uncomfortable silence fell. Martha quietly took the supplies into the house, leaving Katerina and Emmett alone in the yard. The rancher didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dust cloud left by his son's horse. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he finally said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. He is your son. He cares about you in his way. Emmett shook his head. Daniel cares about money and the easy life Caldwell's been dangling in front of him. He doesn't understand what this land means. And what does it mean? Katerina asked softly. Emmett's eyes met hers, surprise flickering across his weathered features. It seemed no one had asked him that question before, or perhaps no one had really wanted to hear the answer. It means everything, he said simply. It's my past and my future. It's where Sarah and I built our life, where Daniel took his first steps. The Sullivans have pulled their living from this soil for 3 generations. I can't be the one to let it go. It was the most he'd spoken to her since her arrival, and Katerina sensed the weight behind the words, not just pride or stubbornness, but a deep, abiding connection to the land beneath their feet. That evening, instead of retreating to her room after supper as usual, Katerina brought out her weaving. Her nimble fingers worked the threads while Emmett sat in his chair by the fire, pretending to read the newspaper, but watching her from the corner of his eye. What are you making? He finally asked, folding the paper in his lap. A wall hanging. In my family, we believe homes need beauty as well as function. I thought perhaps... She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. If I am to stay, I would like to contribute something of myself to this house. And are you staying? His question held no judgment, just quiet curiosity. Katerina's hands stilled. Do you wish me to go? Emmett considered her for a long moment. She wasn't what he'd expected. Not that he'd expected anything, given Martha's deception. But this woman with her direct gaze and capable hands, who didn't shy away from hard work or hard truths, had begun to carve out a space for herself in his home without demanding anything in return. No, he said finally, I don't wish you to. Go. It wasn't a declaration of feeling, not even a real welcome. But as the firelight played across his silver hair and the faintest smile softened his features, Katerina felt something shift between them. The first careful foundation of understanding being laid, stone by stone. The first streak of dawn had barely touched the eastern horizon when Katerina woke. Her body was still adjusting to ranch life, but there was comfort in the routine. The creak of floorboards, the distant lowing of cattle, the scent of coffee drifting up from the kitchen, where Martha would already be bustling about. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, a practical skirt and blouse she had altered to allow for greater freedom of movement. The kitchen was warm, filled with morning light and the smell of biscuits baking. Martha stood at the stove, her silver hair neatly pinned despite the early hour. You're up with the birds again, Martha observed, sliding a cup of coffee toward Katerina. Did you sleep well? Better than before, Katerina admitted. The nightmares that had plagued her first few nights, memories of why she had truly left her homeland, had begun to subside, replaced by dreamless exhaustion from days of physical labor. Mr. Sullivan is checking the north pasture today, Martha said casually, though something in her tone suggested the information was offered with purpose. The wildflowers are beautiful there this time of year, despite the drought. Might be worth seeing if you have time after your chores. Katerina nodded, understanding the gentle nudge. In the week since their conversation by the fireplace, Emmett had been different, not dramatically so, but the wall between them had lowered slightly. He'd begun asking her questions about her homeland over supper, listening with genuine interest to her descriptions of village life in the Carpathian foothills. Once when she'd mentioned her father's death from pneumonia when she was 16, she'd caught a flash of something in his eyes, recognition of shared grief perhaps. After breakfast, Katerina tackled her morning chores, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping Martha with the laundry. The physicality of the work was satisfying, so different from the cramped factory where she'd spent 2 years before answering Martha's letter. There, the air had been thick with lint, and the foreman's wandering hands a constant threat. Here, despite the gossip in town and Daniel's open hostility, she felt something approaching safety. By midday, the laundry was fluttering on the line. The kitchen was spotless, and Martha was preparing to start the bread dough. The older woman shooed Katerina away when she offered to help. "Go on, get some air," Martha insisted. "You've been cooped up too much. Take some lunch to Mr. Sullivan. He always forgets to eat when he's working." Katerina wrapped biscuits, cold chicken, and apple slices in a cloth, tucking the bundle into a small basket along with a jar of water. The north pasture lay beyond a gentle rise, following the curve of the creek as it wound through the property. The path was well worn, evidence of Emmett's daily rounds. The wildflowers Martha had mentioned dotted the grassland in defiant splashes of color: purple lupine, bright orange paintbrush, delicate blue, forget-me-nots clinging to life despite the parched earth. Katerina paused to gather a small bunch, an instinctive gesture that reminded her of walks with her mother long ago. She spotted Emmett before he saw her. He was kneeling beside an injured calf, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined a cut on the animal's leg. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and for a moment, with his face relaxed in concentration, the years seemed to fall away from him. Katerina could glimpse the younger man he had been, still serious perhaps, but unweathered by loss. "I brought you lunch," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. Emmett looked up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something less guarded. "You didn't need to do that. Martha was concerned you would work through the day without eating. I have come to learn that Martha is usually right about such things." The hint of a smile touched his lips. "Martha's been mothering me for 30 years. I'm used to it." Katerina spread the cloth on a relatively flat rock, setting out the simple meal while Emmett finished tending to the calf. When he joined her, wiping his hands on a bandana, she noticed how the lines around his eyes deepened when he squinted against the sun. "The calf will be all right," he said, anticipating her question. "Just caught herself on some barbed wire, nothing serious." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the distant mountains standing like sentinels against the vast blue sky. Emmett seemed more at ease out here, away from the house with its memories and expectations. "Thank you," he said finally, nodding toward the empty cloth. "It's been a while since anyone brought me lunch in the field. Not since—" He trailed off, but Katerina understood. "Not since his wife. Martha told me about Sarah," she said carefully. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman." Emmett's eyes clouded briefly. "She was. Too good for a hard-headed rancher like me, that's for certain." He looked at Katerina directly. "I'm sure you've heard plenty from the town gossips already, about how I've let the place go since she died, how I drove my son away." "I do not listen to gossip," Katerina replied firmly, "and I do not judge what I do not understand." Something in her tone made him study her more closely. "You've had your share of judgment, I'd wager." Katerina looked down at her hands, calloused from work, but still bearing the small scars from years at the sewing machine. "In my village, a woman without a husband by 20 was considered unfortunate. By 25, she was pitied. By my age—" She shrugged. "There must be something wrong with her." Too stubborn, too plain, too damaged. And were you any of those things? Stubborn, yes, she admitted with a small smile. The rest, perhaps that is for others to decide. Emmett was quiet for a moment, breaking a twig between his fingers. Daniel's mother died when he was 10. Sarah and I married 3 years later. She loved him like her own, but he never quite forgave me for bringing someone new into our lives. He sighed. Now he thinks I'm being stubborn about the ranch out of spite. He doesn't understand that selling would be like cutting out a piece of myself. I understand, Katerina said softly. To be rooted somewhere. It is a precious thing. Their eyes met, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. Recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood the value of holding on when the rest of the world told you to let go. The spell was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They both turned to see a rider approaching from the direction of town. Sheriff Thomas Green, his badge catching the sunlight as he drew nearer. Emmett stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers, his expression closing off once more. Something's wrong. Tom doesn't ride out unless there's trouble. The sheriff reined in his horse, tipping his hat respectfully to Katerina before addressing Emmett. Sullivan, sorry to interrupt your lunch, but I thought you should hear this directly from me rather than through the grapevine. What's happened? Emmett asked, his voice tight. Caldwell's filed for water rights to the Upper Creek, the section that feeds down onto your property. Claims the treaty with the Blackfoot gives him historical precedent. Katerina watched the color drain from Emmett's face. Even she understood the implications. Without water rights, the ranch would be finished. No irrigation for the hayfields, no water for the cattle, nothing. He can't do that, Emmett said, though his tone lacked conviction. That creek's been part of Sullivan land since my grandfather's time. Sheriff Green sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. The law's complicated on water rights, Emmett. You know that. Caldwell's got lawyers from Helena working on his case. The hearing's set for 3 weeks from now in the county seat. 3 weeks? Emmett's hands clenched into fists. How am I supposed to prepare a legal defense in 3 weeks, while running this place alone? The sheriff glanced at Katerina, then back to Emmett. You're not entirely alone anymore from what I see. After the sheriff departed, Emmett stood silent, staring at the thin ribbon of creek that meant everything to his ranch's survival. Katerina waited, sensing his need to process the threat. He won't stop until he has everything. Emmett finally said, his voice hollow. First he tries to buy me out. When that fails, he sends Daniel to convince me. Now this. He turned to Katerina, his eyes hard with resolve. I won't give in. Not to Caldwell, not to anyone. Then we will fight, Katerina said simply. Emmett blinked, clearly surprised by her use of we. This isn't your battle, Katerina. You have given me a home when I had none, she replied. In my country, that creates an obligation, a debt of honor. Besides, she added with the faintest smile, I have some experience fighting battles others think cannot be won. Back at the ranch house, Martha took the news about the water rights with grim resignation. That snake's been planning this for years, she muttered as she aggressively kneaded bread dough, just waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, instead of retreating to his study after supper as usual, Emmett spread maps and documents across the kitchen table. Land deeds, water surveys, boundary markers, the paper history of Sullivan Ranch laid bare. Katerina and Martha joined him, the three of them poring over yellowed documents by lamplight. My grandfather kept records of everything, Emmett explained, carefully unfolding a hand-drawn map from 1856. He was the one who negotiated with the Blackfoot for settlement rights. There has to be something here that proves our claim to the water. Hours passed as they sorted through the family archives. Martha eventually dozed off in her chair, while Emmett's frustration mounted with each fruitless document. Katerina noticed How he rubbed his eyes, the strain evident in the set of his shoulders. "Perhaps we should continue tomorrow," she suggested gently. "Fresh eyes might see what tired ones miss." Emmett looked up, seeming to really notice her for the first time in hours. Her hair had come loose from its pins, falling in dark waves around her face, and a smudge of dust marked her cheek. She had stayed with him through the entire evening without complaint, organizing documents and asking thoughtful questions. "You should get some rest," he agreed, his voice softening. "Thank you for your help. It's been a long time since I had someone to share a burden with." Their eyes met across the table, the lamplight casting warm shadows between them. Katerina felt a flutter in her chest, not romantic longing exactly, but something equally powerful, the recognition of not being alone. The next morning, Katerina rose even earlier than usual. She had an idea that had come to her in the pre-dawn hours, something mentioned in one of the older documents they'd reviewed. After quickly dressing, she slipped out to the barn, where the rest of the family archives were stored in trunks. The first fingers of dawn were touching the mountains when Emmett found her there, surrounded by papers and journals, a look of triumph on her face. "I found something," she said without preamble, holding up a leather-bound journal. "Your grandmother's diary from 1862. She writes about a treaty amendment that was never filed with the county, a verbal agreement between your grandfather and Chief Running Elk about water access that was witnessed by a government agent." Emmett took the journal with reverent hands, his eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "The agent's name is here. If we could track down his official reports, they would be in the territorial archives," Katerina finished. "Your grandmother writes that copies were sent to Helena." For the first time since she'd known him, Emmett Sullivan smiled fully, a transformation that took years from his face and sent an unexpected warmth through Katerina's body. "You're remarkable," he said simply. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Emmett made arrangements to travel to Helena to search the territorial archives, while Katerina and Martha kept the ranch running in his absence. The drought continued unabated, the creek shrinking daily, making their legal fight all the more urgent. Word of their resistance to Caldwell's water claim spread through Milbrook, dividing the small community. Some, like Sheriff Green, quietly supported the Sullivans' right to their land and water. Others, particularly those who benefited from Caldwell's business interests, were less sympathetic. Katerina felt the change whenever she went into town, the stares more pointed, the whispers more malicious. Eleanor Whitman no longer bothered to lower her voice when she called Katerina that foreign gold digger, loudly speculating that she had trapped poor Emmett Sullivan to gain American citizenship. "Don't let them get to you," Martha advised after one particularly unpleasant trip to the general store. "Small minds fear what they don't understand, and they certainly don't understand a woman who chooses her own path." Despite Martha's encouragement, the constant scrutiny wore on Katerina. One afternoon, seeking solitude, she followed the creek to its widest point on the property, a shallow pool shaded by cottonwood trees. The spot felt sacred somehow, untouched by the human dramas playing out around it. She was sketching the gnarled roots of the oldest tree when she heard footsteps approaching. Turning quickly, she was relieved to see it was Daniel Sullivan, not Victor Caldwell as she had feared. Still, the young man's hostile expression gave her pause. "So this is where you hide," he said, his tone accusatory. "Playing the devoted. Ranch wife while my father's away?" Katerina closed her sketchbook calmly. "I am not hiding, Mr. Sullivan, nor am I playing at anything. Aren't you?" He stepped closer, his resemblance to his father striking despite the cruelty in his expression. "Caldwell told me everything. How women like you target lonely old men, how you'll bleed him dry before moving on to the next victim." "Mr. Caldwell knows nothing about me?" Katerina replied, standing her ground. "Nor, it seems, do you know much about your father if you think he could be so easily deceived." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "My father stopped thinking clearly the day my mother, who died. Sarah managed to keep him functional for a while, but since she's been gone..." He shook his head. "This ranch is killing him, and now you're helping him destroy himself over a worthless piece of land. Is that what Mr. Caldwell told you? That this land is worthless? It's the truth. Look around you. The creek's drying up. The cattle are thin. The buildings are falling apart. My father could sell to Caldwell, live comfortably in town, maybe even reconcile with me. Instead, he's fighting a losing battle, and you're encouraging him." Katerina studied the young man before her, seeing beyond his anger to the hurt beneath. "You love your father in your way, but you cannot decide his happiness for him. This land, this ranch, it is his heart. To take it from him would be to take the last piece of himself he has left." "And what about me?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm his son, his blood. Why isn't that enough for him?" The vulnerability in the question caught Katerina off guard. For all his bluster, Daniel Sullivan was still a boy seeking his father's approval. "Perhaps," she said gently, "you should ask him that question yourself. Not through Mr. Caldwell, not through lawyers, but as a son to his father." Daniel stared at her, conflict evident in his expression. For a moment, Katerina thought she might have reached him. Then his face hardened once more. "Caldwell was right. About you, you're clever with your words. But it won't matter in the end. When the water rights are settled, my father will have no choice but to sell. And then we'll see what happens to your arrangement." He stalked away, leaving Katerina troubled by the encounter. She had glimpsed something in Daniel that gave her hope, a crack in his anger that might eventually allow reconciliation. But his warning about the water rights hearing echoed ominously. Emmett returned from Helena 3 days later, exhausted but triumphant. He had found the territorial agent's reports confirming the verbal agreement about water rights. The documents weren't conclusive, but they provided enough legal foundation to challenge Caldwell's claim. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Emmett seemed more relaxed than Katerina had ever seen him. His silver hair caught the fading light, and the lines around his eyes crinkled as he described the archives in Helena. "I spoke to a lawyer while I was there," he mentioned, watching her reaction carefully. "About your immigration status." Katerina stiffened. They had never discussed the terms of her staying beyond that brief conversation by the fire. "I see. No, I don't think you do." Emmett's voice was gentle. "I asked what would be required for you to remain in the country legally, regardless of our arrangement." He said there are options, employment sponsorship for one. "You would employ me, officially, if that's what you want." He hesitated, choosing his next words with care. "Katerina, I know you came here expecting a marriage. Martha led you to believe that's what I was offering. But I've watched you these past weeks. How hard you work, how you've adapted to this place, how you've stood with me against Caldwell. You deserve more than a marriage of convenience to an old rancher." Katerina felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You think me too good for such an arrangement? I think you deserve a choice, real choices, not just the ones forced on you by circumstance." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. For so long, her life had been a series of reactions to events beyond her control. Her father's death, the factory work, the growing danger in her village that had finally forced her to flee. Emmett Sullivan was offering her something she'd never truly had, agency. "And if my choice is to stay," she asked quietly, "not as an employee, but as a partner in this life you've built?" Emmett's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "You can't possibly want..." "Do not tell me what I want," Katerina interrupted, a flash of her natural fire breaking through. "I have had enough of others deciding that for me. I'm not a young girl with romantic fantasies, Mr. Sullivan. I'm a woman who knows the value of a home, of purpose, of standing with someone against whatever comes. If that is not what you want, then say so plainly. But do not presume to decide for me." In the silence that followed, something shifted between them, a final barrier falling away. Emmett reached across the space between their chairs, his weathered hand covering hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as my employee, not even as my wife, unless someday that's truly what you want. Stay as my partner, Katerina. Help me fight for this land." In that moment, with the mountains witnessing their pact, Katerina felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope, fragile but real, blossoming in the space between two people who had found in each other not what the world thought they needed, but what they actually did. The water rights hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. They had 1 week to prepare their case against Caldwell's legal team, 1 week to save Sullivan Ranch from a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. 1 week that would determine not just the fate of a piece of land, but of the unexpected bond that had formed between a silver-haired rancher and the woman everyone had deemed too old to matter. The day of the water rights hearing dawned clear and hot, the sky a merciless blue that promised no relief from the drought. Katerina stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, pinning her hair into a severe style that she hoped conveyed respectability. The dress she wore was her finest, dark blue with a lace collar altered to fit her precisely. It wasn't fashionable by Milbrook standards, but it was dignified. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. "You look like you're heading into battle." "In a way I am," Katerina replied, securing the final pin. She touched the amber pendant at her throat, her mother's, the one thing she had brought from her homeland that held true value. "How is Mr. Sullivan this morning?" "Nervous, though he'd sooner die than admit it," Martha said with a fond shake of her head. "He's been up since before dawn, checking and rechecking those documents." The kitchen was filled with the scent of coffee and fresh bread, but Emmett sat at the table untouched, surrounded by papers. He looked up when Katerina entered, his eyes widening slightly at her formal appearance. "You look..." He cleared his throat. "That is, you don't need to come to the hearing. It might get unpleasant." Katerina poured herself coffee, her movements deliberate. "I'm not afraid of unpleasantness, Mr. Sullivan. Besides, we prepared this case together. I should be there to witness the outcome." Something flickered in his eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. The past week had changed things between them. In preparing for the hearing, they had worked side by side late into each night, shoulders touching as they pored over maps and legal precedents. Emmett had begun to defer to her organizational skills, while she had come to rely on his deep knowledge of the land. They had developed a rhythm, a partnership that felt natural despite its unlikely beginnings. "Very well," he conceded, "but stay close to Martha. Caldwell's supporters can be unkind." The ride to the county courthouse was tense, with anticipation. Emmett drove the wagon, his posture rigid, his silver hair nearly glowing in the morning light. Katerina sat beside him, their shoulders occasionally brushing over the rough road. Martha rode in the back, with the documents secured in a leather portfolio. The physical evidence of their claim, fragile as hope itself. The courthouse in the county seat was larger and more imposing than any building in Milbrook. A 2-story brick structure with white columns and a cupola that gleamed against the sky. A crowd had gathered on the steps, evidence that word of the dispute had spread throughout the county. Many were ranchers like Emmett, men whose livelihoods also depended on water rights and who watched Caldwell's expansion with growing unease. As they approached, the crowd parted. Katerina felt the weight of stares, heard the whispers that followed them like shadows. "Mail order bride," someone hissed. "Poor Sullivan," another voice added. She kept her chin high, her eyes fixed forward. Beside her, Emmett's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Inside, the courtroom was already half-filled. Victor Caldwell sat at the front table, flanked by two well-dressed men who could only be his lawyers. When Caldwell spotted them, his lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying across the room. "Last chance to be reasonable. My offer still stands. More than fair market value for a failing ranch." Emmett didn't reply, guiding Katerina and Martha to the opposite table with a gentle hand at Katerina's elbow. The small gesture of protectiveness did not go unnoticed by those watching. "Looks like Sullivan's got himself a foreign lawyer now," someone remarked loudly. Laughter rippled through Caldwell's supporters. Katerina felt Emmett stiffen beside her. "Ignore them," she murmured. "They want to provoke you before the hearing even begins." He nodded slightly, his expression grim but controlled. They arranged their documents methodically, the three of them working in practiced coordination. Katerina noticed Daniel Sullivan slip into the back of the courtroom, his expression unreadable as he took a seat neither among Caldwell's supporters nor near his father. The judge, a stern-faced man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, entered promptly at 10 o'clock. Judge Harold Monroe had a reputation for fairness but strict adherence to the letter of the law. Katerina had learned from Sheriff Green that Monroe had no particular love for Caldwell, but neither did he let personal feelings influence his rulings. "This court will come to order," the bailiff announced. "The matter before us is Caldwell versus Sullivan regarding water rights to the North Branch of Pinecrest Creek." The proceedings began with Caldwell's lawyer presenting their case, a polished argument based on territorial maps, prior appropriation doctrine, and the fact that the upper portion of the creek crossed Caldwell's newly acquired properties before flowing onto Sullivan land. "Your Honor," the lawyer concluded, "Mr. Caldwell has legitimate claim to these water rights based on both geographic precedent and beneficial use. He plans significant agricultural development that will bring prosperity to the entire county. But this development requires secure water access." Judge Monroe turned to Emmett. "Mr. Sullivan, are you represented by counsel today?" Emmett stood, his dignity palpable despite his worn suit and weathered hands. "No, Your Honor, I'll be presenting my own case, with assistance from my—" He hesitated, glancing at Katerina. "From my partner, Miss Petrova." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The term partner carried weight, not quite claiming her as his wife, but certainly more than a mail-order bride or household help. Katerina felt a flush of warmth at the public acknowledgement. "Very well," Judge Monroe said. "You may proceed." Emmett began simply, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. He traced his family's history on the land, the 3 generations of Sullivans who had ranched alongside Pinecrest Creek. He explained how his grandfather had negotiated with the Blackfoot tribe for settlement rights, establishing water usage patterns that had remained unchanged for nearly 40 years. Then he produced their most compelling evidence, the territorial agent's reports confirming the verbal agreement that had been witnessed but never formally recorded with the county. "Your Honor, these documents clearly establish that my grandfather was granted explicit rights to the water flowing through the property, regardless of upstream usage. The agreement was made in good faith and has been honored for decades." Caldwell's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These supposed reports are merely hearsay. There's no official county record of this alleged agreement." "The territorial agent was a government representative," Emmett countered. His reports constitute official documentation, even if they weren't filed locally. Judge Monroe examined the reports carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "I'll take these under consideration, Mr. Sullivan. Please continue." Emmett nodded to Katerina, who passed him the maps they had prepared. These survey maps from 1856, 1873, and 1890 show consistent water usage patterns on Sullivan Ranch. Under prior appropriation doctrine, our continued beneficial use of this water for nearly half a century establishes our claim. For over an hour, Emmett presented their case methodically, his arguments simple but powerful. Katerina watched with quiet pride as this man who claimed to be just a rancher spoke with the conviction of someone defending not just property, but a way of life. When Emmett finished, Judge Monroe removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose thoughtfully. "Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to offer rebuttal?" Caldwell himself stood this time, adjusting his expensive vest with manicured hands. "Your Honor, I have great respect for tradition and family legacy, but Montana territory is growing, developing. Progress requires change. Mr. Sullivan clings to an outdated model of ranching that can no longer sustain itself, as evidenced by his property's declining condition." Katerina felt Emmett tense beside her. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a silent reminder to maintain his composure. "The territorial agent's reports are interesting historical artifacts," Caldwell continued smoothly, "but they don't constitute legally binding documentation. The fact remains that the north branch of Pinecrest Creek originates on my property and flows through 3 miles of my land before reaching Sullivan Ranch. Under riparian doctrine, this gives me primary rights to that water." The courtroom had grown warm as the morning progressed, the air thick with tension and too many bodies in too small a space. Katerina noticed Martha dabbing her forehead with a handkerchief, her normally pink cheeks pale with fatigue. The elderly housekeeper had insisted on attending despite her age, declaring that she'd see Victor Caldwell in hell before letting him steal Emmett's water. Judge Monroe closed his notebook, his expression solemn. "I've heard compelling arguments from both parties. This case involves complex questions of water law, historical precedent, and documentation validity. I'll need time to review all evidence presented and render a fair judgment." Katerina's heart sank. They had hoped for an immediate ruling, something to end the anxiety that had gripped the ranch for weeks. "I'll issue my decision in 1 week's time," the judge concluded, rising from his seat. "Until then, the current water usage arrangements will remain in effect. Court is adjourned." The crowd began to disperse, a buzz of speculation filling the air. Caldwell approached their table, his confidence undiminished. "A week's delay changes nothing, Sullivan," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "The law is on my side, but my offer still stands. Sell now, while you still have some bargaining power." Emmett gathered their documents without looking up. "The ranch isn't for sale, Caldwell. Not now, not ever. We'll see about that when your creek runs dry." Caldwell's gaze shifted to Katerina, his eyes cold with assessment. "Miss Petrova, you're an intelligent woman. Surely you can see the futility of attaching yourself to a failing enterprise. I could use someone with your determination in my business interests." The implication was clear and repulsive. Katerina met his gaze steadily. "I have already found where I belong, Mr. Caldwell. Perhaps you should look to your own enterprises rather than coveting what others have built." Caldwell's smile tightened. "Loyalty is admirable if misplaced. I hope it keeps you warm when winter comes and Sullivan can't afford coal." He departed with his lawyers, leaving a chill in his wake, despite the warm courtroom. Martha sniffed disapprovingly. "That man's heart is as dry as this drought, always wanting what isn't his." Outside, the midday sun beat down mercilessly. As they loaded their documents into the wagon, Katerina noticed Daniel hovering nearby, his expression conflicted. Emmett saw him too, his shoulders stiffening. "Father," Daniel began, approaching cautiously, Your presentation was well argued." It wasn't quite an olive branch, but it was the closest thing to approval Daniel had offered in years. Emmett seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Thank you," he finally said, his tone guarded but not hostile. "Judge Monroe is fair. He'll consider the evidence." An awkward silence fell between them, years of hurt and miscommunication creating a gulf, wider than words could easily bridge. "Mr. Caldwell thinks the judge will rule in his favor," Daniel said finally. "Mr. Caldwell believes what suits him," Katerina interjected, "just as he has led you to believe what serves his interests." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I know what I've seen with my own eyes. The ranch is struggling, has been for years. And whose fault is that?" Emmett's voice was quiet but cutting. "Who left when the work got hard, when we needed every hand to keep things going?" "I left because you couldn't see past your own grief," Daniel shot back, color rising in his cheeks. "After Sarah died, it was like you died too. The ranch became everything, not me, not our relationship, just the endless, thankless work." Katerina glanced around, aware they were creating a scene on the courthouse steps. "Perhaps this conversation would be better continued in private," she suggested gently. Both Sullivan men looked at her, then at each other. Identical expressions of stubborn pride on their faces. "There's nothing more to say," Emmett stated flatly, turning back to the wagon. "There never is with you," Daniel muttered, but Katerina caught the flash of hurt beneath his anger. "Daniel," she said quietly as Emmett walked away, "come to the ranch for supper tomorrow. Not to argue, just to talk. Please." He hesitated, glancing at his father's retreating back. "He won't want me there." "He might not say it, but he does," Martha put in, joining the conversation. "Stubborn as mules, both of you. Always have been." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that Katerina had to hide a smile. "I'll think about it," he finally said before walking away. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, each of them lost in thoughts of what the judge's decision might mean for their future. The land seemed to reflect their mood, parched, waiting, holding its breath for relief that might not come. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Emmett suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. "Look," he said softly. In the distance, dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, the first promise of rain they'd seen in months. Katerina felt a flutter of hope in her chest, watching the shadows move across the landscape. "Do you think it will reach us?" she asked. "Hard to say," Emmett replied. "Summer storms are unpredictable, but right now I'll take any sign of hope we can get." Back at the ranch, they unloaded the documents in silence. Martha went to start dinner, while Emmett retreated to the barn to check on a new calf born the previous day. Katerina changed out of her formal dress, replacing it with her everyday work clothes, then headed to the vegetable garden that she had started tending since her arrival. The small plot was struggling in the drought, but she had managed to coax a few hardy plants into producing. She knelt in the dry soil, pulling weeds and checking for any signs of pests. The physical labor was soothing after the tension of the courthouse. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Emmett approach until his shadow fell across the garden rows. "You don't have to do that today," he said. "You've already done enough." Katerina sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "I find it helps me think." He nodded, understanding. After a moment's hesitation, he lowered himself to the ground beside her, his knees creaking slightly. Without a word, he began pulling weeds from the adjacent row. They worked side by side, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. The distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm provided a backdrop to their rhythmic movements. Daniel might come for supper tomorrow, Katerina mentioned eventually, keeping her tone casual. Emmett's hands stilled. He told you that? He said he would think about it. She glanced sideways at him. It might be good to clear the air, especially now. Emmett sighed, rubbing his thumb across a tomato leaf. Daniel and I haven't had a civil conversation in years. I'm not sure we remember how. Then perhaps it's time to learn again, Katerina said gently. You were both wounded by loss. You both made choices based on that pain, but you're still father and son. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new in the woman who had arrived as a stranger just over a month ago. When did you become so wise about a family you barely know? A sad smile touched her lips. I know what it is to lose family, Mr. Sullivan. My father to illness, my mother to grief afterward, my brother to war. When you have lost so much, what remains becomes more precious, not less. Emmett was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on his knees. I've been unfair to you, he finally said. When Martha first told me about writing to you, I was angry. I thought she was trying to replace Sarah, or worse, trying to foist some desperate woman on me out of pity. Katerina continued her weeding, giving him space to find his words. But you're not what I expected, he continued. You're stronger, more determined. You didn't come here looking for someone to save you, and these past weeks with Caldwell and the water rights. He shook his head. I couldn't have faced it alone. You would have, she said with certainty, but I'm glad you didn't have to. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed, unexpected but undeniable. Not romance, not yet, but a foundation of respect and understanding that was perhaps more valuable. The moment was, broken by the first fat drops of rain, striking the dry earth with audible taps. They looked up at the darkening sky in unison, expressions of wonder on their faces. Inside, Emmett said, rising quickly and offering her his hand. These summer storms can turn dangerous fast. Katerina took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. His palm was warm against hers, calloused from work but gentle in its strength. Neither let go immediately, the contact lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary. They made it to the porch just as the skies opened, rain falling in sheets that transformed the parched yard into a series of puddles within minutes. The sound on the roof was like applause, and the scent of wet earth rose up in a heady perfume. Perfect timing, Martha called from the doorway. And not just the rain. Sheriff Green just rode up. Emmett's expression clouded with concern. He and Katerina exchanged glances before hurrying inside, where Thomas Green stood dripping onto the entryway rug, his expression grim despite the blessed rainfall. What's happened? Emmett asked without preamble. There was an incident in town, the sheriff replied, accepting the towel Martha offered. Someone set fire to the legal office where the territorial documents are kept. Started in the records room. Katerina felt her blood run cold. The agent's reports? The ones we presented today? Sheriff Green nodded solemnly. Among other things, Judge Monroe had already returned them to the repository for safekeeping until his ruling. Were they destroyed? Emmett's voice was hoarse. Some records were saved, some weren't. Won't know the full extent of the damage until they sort through. Everything. The sheriff's eyes were hard, but I think we all know this wasn't an accident. Caldwell, Emmett breathed, his hands clenching into fists. I can't prove that, Sheriff Green cautioned. And neither can you, Emmett. But I thought you should know. The judge is reconsidering the timeline for his decision in light of the missing evidence. Katerina felt the hope that had blossomed with the rainstorm wither inside her. Without the territorial agent's reports, their case was significantly weakened. Caldwell would claim the fire was unfortunate timing, while quietly celebrating the destruction of their most compelling evidence. What happens now? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "The hearing will reconvene in 3 days," Green replied. "Judge Monroe wants to see what records can be salvaged and whether there are copies elsewhere." After the sheriff departed, declining dinner due to other duties in the wake of the fire, the three of them sat in stunned silence around the kitchen table. The rain continued to fall outside, a sound that should have brought joy now overshadowed by this new threat. "It's too convenient," Martha finally said, voicing what they were all thinking. "That fire happening today of all days." "Caldwell's always been ruthless in business," Emmett agreed, "but I never thought he'd stoop to destruction of public property." Katerina's mind was racing, considering possibilities. The territorial agent, might he have kept personal copies of his reports, or would duplicates have been sent to other government offices? Possible, Emmett acknowledged. But finding them in 3 days? He shook his head. Even if they exist, we'd need to know exactly where to look. Katerina rose from the table suddenly, struck by a memory. "The diary. Your grandmother's diary mentioned the agent by name, Augustus Franklin, and she wrote that he was friends with your grandfather, that he visited the ranch several times." Emmett's eyes widened slightly. "You think he might have left copies of his reports here?" "It's worth looking," Katerina insisted. "Your grandfather kept meticulous records. If Agent Franklin gave him copies..." They spent the remainder of the evening searching through the family archives stored in the attic, dusty trunks filled with decades of ranch history. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, occasionally punctuated by thunder that rattled the windows. It was nearly midnight when Martha, who had insisted on helping despite her age, let out a triumphant cry. "Look at this!" She held up a packet of yellowed papers tied with faded ribbon. It was in Sarah's hope chest of all places. Letters from Augustus Franklin to your grandfather, with what looked like duplicates of his official reports attached. Emmett took the packet with reverent hands, carefully untying the ribbon. The papers were fragile with age, but the handwriting was clear. Detailed accounts of the water rights agreement, signed and dated by both Agent Franklin and Chief Running Elk of the Blackfoot tribe. "These are even more specific than the ones we presented in court," Emmett said, his voice tight with emotion. "Franklin explicitly states that water rights to the entire creek were granted to Sullivan Ranch in perpetuity." Katerina felt a surge of hope. This changes everything. Caldwell may have destroyed the official records, but he couldn't have known about these personal copies. As they carefully preserved their newfound evidence, the storm outside began to ease, the rain softening to a gentle patter. It seemed fitting somehow, the violence passing, leaving behind the quiet nourishment the land so desperately needed. Later, as Katerina prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Emmett standing in the hallway, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his expression both exhausted and animated. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for remembering the diary, for thinking of possibilities I wouldn't have considered." "We make a good team, Mr. Sullivan," she replied with a small smile. He hesitated, then reached out to take her hand, the gesture tentative but deliberate. "Emmett," he said, "after everything we've been through, I think you can call me Emmett." "Emmett," she repeated, liking how the name felt on her tongue. His hand remained in hers, warm and solid, a connection that anchored them both in the uncertain, darkness. "Whatever happens with the hearing," he continued, "I want you to know that you have a place here. Not because of any arrangement or obligation, but because..." He paused, searching for words. "Because this ranch is better with you on it. I'm better with you here." It wasn't a declaration of love, nor did Katerina expect one. It was something more valuable. Recognition, appreciation, the acknowledgement that they had found in each Other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. "Thank you," she said simply, giving his hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. He nodded, something softening in his eyes, then turned to go. "Get some rest, Katerina. We have a battle to win in the morning." As she closed her door, Katerina listened to the rain continuing to fall, gentle now, persistent, life-giving. Like hope, she thought, like new beginnings in places where you least expect to find them. 3 days after the discovery of Agent Franklin's personal letters, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. News of the suspicious fire had spread throughout the county, drawing spectators eager to witness what many now viewed as a clash between David and Goliath. Sullivan, ranch against Caldwell's growing empire. The rain that had blessed the parched land had continued intermittently, bringing temporary relief, but not enough to end the drought that had plagued the region for months. Still, Katerina chose to see it as a positive omen as she sat beside Emmett at the plaintiff's table, Franklin's letters carefully preserved in a leather portfolio on her lap. Martha had insisted on attending despite Emmett's concerns about her health, declaring that wild horses couldn't keep her away. She sat in the first row behind them, her Sunday best somewhat faded but impeccably pressed, her silver hair arranged in a neat coronet beneath her hat. Victor Caldwell entered with his lawyers, his confident stride faltering slightly when he noticed the satisfied expressions on the Sullivan party's faces. He leaned down to whisper something to his lead attorney, who frowned and shook his head. "He knows something's changed," Katerina murmured to Emmett. "Look at his eyes." Emmett nodded, his own expression carefully neutral. They had agreed not to reveal their new evidence until the judge requested it, maximizing its impact and giving Caldwell no time to prepare a counter-argument. Judge Monroe entered, looking more somber than before. The courtroom fell silent as he arranged his papers and cleared his throat. "This court is reconvened to continue hearing the matter of water rights to Pinecrest Creek," he announced formally. "As many of you are aware, certain evidence presented in our previous session was unfortunately lost in the fire at the county records office. Sheriff Green continues to investigate the cause of that incident." The judge's eyes swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Caldwell before continuing. "Given these unusual circumstances, I've asked both parties to present any additional or replacement evidence they may have, after which I will render my decision." He turned to Caldwell's table first. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have anything to add? And to your previous arguments?" Caldwell rose smoothly, adjusting his expensive vest. "Your Honor, while the fire was indeed unfortunate, it doesn't change the fundamental facts of our case. The territorial agent's reports, while interesting historical artifacts, were never officially filed with the county. My claim rests on current property boundaries and water law as it exists today, not on verbal agreements made decades ago." Judge Monroe nodded without expression. "Mr. Sullivan," Emmett stood, and Katerina noticed that he seemed different today, more confident, his shoulders straighter, his voice steadier as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, the fire that destroyed the county records was indeed unfortunate and suspicious in its timing." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "However, we have located additional documentation that not only supports but strengthens our previous evidence." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Caldwell shifted in his seat, his composure slipping momentarily. "Proceed, Mr. Sullivan," the judge instructed. Katerina handed Emmett the portfolio. He carefully removed the letters, his hands steady despite the tension in the room. "I present to the court personal correspondence between Territorial Agent Augustus Franklin and my grandfather, Jacob Sullivan, dated 1862 through 1865. Emmett passed the documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Monroe. These letters include duplicates of the agent's official reports with additional details regarding the water rights agreement with the Blackfoot tribe. Judge Monroe examined the letters with careful attention, his expression revealing nothing. The courtroom remained silent, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation. "These appear authentic," the judge finally said. "Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to examine this evidence?" Caldwell's lawyer stood quickly. "We do, Your Honor, and we question the convenient timing of their discovery. It seems highly coincidental that just as the official records are destroyed, Mr. Sullivan produces personal copies that no one has seen before. Not coincidental?" "At all," Emmett countered. "We were unaware of these letters until the fire necessitated a more thorough search of our family archives. My late wife had preserved them among her personal effects, recognizing their importance to the ranch's history." Judge Monroe held up a hand to silence any further debate. "I'll examine these documents carefully. In the meantime, I'd like to call a witness who may provide context for this situation." He nodded to the bailiff, who opened a side door. To everyone's surprise, Daniel Sullivan entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Daniel Sullivan," the judge said, "please approach." "The bench." Daniel walked forward, his eyes briefly meeting his father's stunned gaze before focusing on the judge. "Mr. Sullivan, you've worked closely with Mr. Caldwell in recent years, is that correct?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've helped manage several of his properties." "And in that capacity, have you had any discussions regarding your father's ranch and the water rights to Pinecrest Creek?" Katerina felt Emmett tense beside her. She placed her hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support as his son prepared to testify. Daniel hesitated, his expression conflicted. "I have, Your Honor. Please share the nature of those discussions with the court." Taking a deep breath, Daniel squared his shoulders. "Mr. Caldwell has been planning to acquire my father's ranch. For several years, the water rights claim was a strategy to force a sale when direct offers were refused." Gasps and whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Caldwell half rose from his seat, his face flushing with anger, but his lawyer pulled him back down, whispering urgently in his ear. "Order," Judge Monroe commanded, striking his gavel. When quiet returned, he continued, "Mr. Sullivan, are you stating that Mr. Caldwell's water rights claim was made in bad faith?" "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel's voice grew stronger. "He told me specifically that even if he had no legal right to the water, tying the matter up in court would financially drain my father's resources until he had no choice but to sell." Judge Monroe's expression darkened. "That's a serious accusation, young man. Are you willing to sign an affidavit to that effect?" "I am," Daniel said firmly. "I have documentation as well. Notes from meetings where this strategy was discussed." Caldwell was on his feet now, his lawyer unable to restrain him. "This is outrageous. The boy is lying to protect his father's worthless land." "Mr. Caldwell, you will be seated or held in contempt," Judge Monroe warned, his voice sharp with authority. As Caldwell subsided, seething, Daniel continued, "I was wrong to be part of this, Your Honor. Whatever disagreements I have with my father, the ranch has been in our family for generations. It deserves to be protected from those who would exploit it purely for profit." Katerina glanced at Emmett, whose eyes were fixed on his son, a complex mixture of emotions playing across his weathered features. Surprise, confusion, pride, and something like hope. Judge Monroe studied the situation for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "In light of this testimony and the newly discovered documentary evidence, I'm prepared to render my decision." The courtroom fell silent, tension thick in the air as the judge organized his thoughts. "Water is life in Montana," he began. "Our laws regarding its use and distribution must balance current needs with historical precedent, individual rights with community good. In this case, We have documented evidence that water rights to Pinecrest Creek were explicitly granted to Sullivan Ranch in an agreement witnessed by a federal agent. This agreement has been honored for nearly half a century without challenge. Until recent events, he turned a stern gaze toward Caldwell. Furthermore, testimony suggests that the current challenge was made with questionable intent. The court finds in favor of Sullivan Ranch. All water rights to Pinecrest Creek, including the North Branch in question, are confirmed to remain with the property as established in the original territorial agreements. The judge struck his gavel with finality. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers and exclamations. Several neighboring ranchers approached to clap Emmett on the shoulder, their relief evident. Caldwell's defeat was a victory for all small landholders in the county. Katerina stood quietly at Emmett's side, watching as father and son faced each other across the space that had separated them for years. Neither spoke immediately, the weight of too many unresolved feelings making words difficult. Daniel broke the silence first. I should have told you what he was planning. I was angry, but that's no excuse. You did the right thing in the end. Emmett replied, his voice rough with emotion. That's what matters. Martha pushed forward then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For heaven's sake, you two, enough standing around like fence posts. Family hugs each other. The two Sullivan men exchanged uncertain glances, then moved simultaneously, embracing awkwardly at first, then with genuine feeling. Katerina blinked back tears of her own, understanding what it meant for Emmett to have his son return, even partially to the fold. As they gathered their documents to leave, Victor Caldwell approached, his face tight with barely controlled fury. This isn't over, Sullivan. One legal victory doesn't change the fact that your ranch is barely surviving. There are other ways. To acquire land. Emmett regarded him steadily. There always have been, Caldwell, but Sullivan Ranch isn't for sale. Not today, not ever. We'll see about that when winter comes, Caldwell hissed, then turned on his heel and stalked away, his lawyers trailing behind. Despite the threat, the ride back to the ranch was filled with a cautious optimism that none of them had felt in weeks. The afternoon sun broke through scattered clouds, painting the drought-stricken landscape in golden light that somehow made even the struggling fields look beautiful. Daniel had agreed to join them for dinner, an olive branch extended and accepted. As they approached the ranch, Katerina noticed Emmett's expression soften, his eyes taking in the familiar buildings, the land that had been saved, at least for now. I've been thinking, he said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. Caldwell's right about one thing. The ranch is struggling. We need to adapt if we're going to survive. Martha snorted from the back of the wagon. Don't tell me. That snake put ideas in your head. Not the way he intended, Emmett replied with a hint of a smile. But fighting for this place has made me see it differently. We've been doing things the same way for generations. Maybe too long. What are you thinking? Katerina asked, intrigued by the spark of energy in his voice. I'm not sure yet, but I know we need to change. Diversify, perhaps. Find ways to make the ranch sustainable even in drought years. Daniel leaned forward from his horse, riding alongside the wagon. The railroad's bringing new markets within reach. There's demand for different kinds of crops, livestock beyond cattle. Emmett nodded, glancing at his son with something like wonder at this unexpected common ground. We should talk about possibilities, all of us. Katerina felt included in that all, a warm certainty spreading through her chest. She had come to this place as a stranger, a mail-order bride deemed too old at 28. Now, barely 2 months later, she was part of something, a partner in building a future for land she had grown to love as fiercely as its owner. That evening, after a celebration dinner that left even Martha speechless with happiness, Katerina slipped outside to the porch. The air was cooler now, the recent rains having broken the worst of the summer heat. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, more than she had ever seen back home. The creak of the screen door announced Emmett's presence before his footsteps. He joined her at the railing, his silver hair gleaming in the moonlight. "Daniel's staying the night," he said, his voice quiet with disbelief. "In his old room." "That's wonderful," Katerina replied sincerely. "A good first step. He says he wants to help with the harvest, see if we can salvage something from the fields that got rain." Emmett shook his head. "I never thought I'd see the day. People can surprise you when given the chance." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, his blue eyes reflecting starlight. "You've certainly surprised me, Katerina Petrova." She smiled, accepting the compliment with a slight inclination of her head. "As you have surprised me, Emmett Sullivan." A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that comes only with true understanding. Emmett's hand rested on the railing, near hers, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel its warmth. "I've been thinking about what you said before," he began carefully. "About being partners in this life I've built." Katerina's heart quickened, but she kept her expression composed. "Yes? I'm not a young man. I don't have fancy words or grand gestures. But I know what matters now in a way I didn't when you first arrived." His voice grew softer. "You matter, Katerina. What we've built together these past months matters." She turned to face him fully, her amber eyes meeting his blue ones without hesitation. "It matters to me, too. I'm not asking for promises," he continued, "just a chance to see what might grow between us now that we've weathered this storm together." Katerina thought of all the paths that had led her to this moment. The losses in her homeland, the difficult journey, the whispers and judgments she had endured. None of it seemed important now, standing beside this man who saw her not as damaged goods or a last resort, but as a woman of value, of strength, of possibility. "I would like that very much," she said simply. His hand covered hers then, warm and solid, a bridge across the space between them. It wasn't a passionate embrace or a declaration of undying love. They were both too practical, too measured for such dramatics. But in its way, the gesture held more meaning than either could express in words. The weeks that followed the court, victory brought both challenges and unexpected joys to Sullivan Ranch. The rains had come too late to save all the crops, but enough to ensure they wouldn't face starvation in the coming winter. Daniel divided his time between town, where he was helping the sheriff build a case against Caldwell for the fire, and the ranch, where decades of estrangement were slowly healing through shared work and careful conversations. Katerina found herself busier than ever, but with a sense of purpose that filled her with contentment. She expanded her vegetable garden, experimenting with drought-resistant varieties she remembered from her homeland. Martha taught her to preserve the harvest for winter, their hands working side by side as they put up jars of tomatoes, pickles, and jams. In the evenings, she and Emmett would often sit on the porch, planning for the ranch's future. Her practical suggestions, informed by European farming traditions, complemented his deep knowledge of the land. They talked of adding sheep alongside the cattle, of planting hardy grains that could withstand dry spells, of using the creek more efficiently for irrigation. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. On those nights, Emmett's hand would find hers, their fingers intertwining with increasing familiarity. Occasionally he would tell her stories of his youth, of Sarah and their early days on the ranch, of Daniel as a boy. She shared memories of her village, the beauty of the Carpathian forests, the traditions she had carried with her across an ocean. Slowly, without grand declarations or dramatic moments, something deepened between them, a partnership built on mutual respect that was gradually, naturally, becoming something more. On a crisp September morning, with the aspens beginning to turn gold against the mountains, Sheriff Green rode up to the ranch house, his expression more relaxed than they had seen in months. "Thought you'd want to know," he announced as Martha brought him coffee on the porch. "Caldwell's been indicted by the federal prosecutor. Arson, attempted fraud, conspiracy. They're throwing the book at him. Seems he's made powerful enemies beyond just Sullivan Ranch." Emmett received the news with quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. "What happens to his properties?" "Most will go to auction, I expect. His creditors aren't happy. Turns out his empire was built on sand and borrowed money." The sheriff sipped his coffee appreciatively. "Word is the railroad's looking at some parcels. Others might go to neighboring ranches." After the sheriff departed, Emmett found Katerina in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before frost could claim them. She looked up as his shadow fell across the row of beans, her face flushed with exertion, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Caldwell's finished," he said without preamble. "His properties are being liquidated." Katerina straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's good news for the county. His influence was unhealthy." Emmett nodded, then seemed to hesitate, something unfamiliar in his expression. Nervousness, perhaps. "Tom mentioned that the old Miller place is among the properties being auctioned, the small ranch that borders our north pasture." "I remember it," Katerina said. "We passed it on the way to town. Pretty land, with that grove of cottonwoods." "It is pretty," Emmett agreed. "Good water, decent house that needs some work. Perfect size for a small operation. Sheep, maybe, or a horse breeding program." Katerina studied him curiously, sensing there was more to this conversation than idle observation. "It sounds like a good opportunity for someone. I thought," he cleared his throat, "that is, I wondered if you might want to consider it for yourself." Surprise registered on her face. "For myself? You've learned ranching quickly. You have good instincts for the land." His words came faster now, as if he needed to explain himself completely before losing courage. "I know we've been getting closer, but I don't want you to feel that staying at Sullivan Ranch is your only option. You deserve a chance to build something that's truly yours, if that's what you want." Katerina set down her basket of beans, touched beyond words by what he was offering. Not just affection or partnership, but true independence, the freedom to choose her own path, even if it might lead away from him. "You would help me acquire another property, even though it might mean I would leave." Emmett's eyes held hers steadily. "I want you to stay, because you choose to, Katerina. Not because you have nowhere else to go." She stepped closer to him, her heart full. "You are a remarkable man, Emmett Sullivan." "Not remarkable," he demurred, "just old enough to know what matters, and what matters to me is your happiness, wherever you find it." Katerina reached up then, her hand gentle against his weathered cheek. It was the most intimate touch they had shared, and she felt him lean into it slightly, his eyes closing briefly. "My happiness," she said softly, "is here. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have found where I belong. With you, with this land, with the life we are building together." His arms encircled her then, drawing her against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady like the man himself. "I'm too old and set in my ways to be anything but direct," he murmured against her hair. "I love you, Katerina. Not because you helped save the ranch, or because you're the only woman willing to take on a stubborn old rancher, but because you are exactly who you are, strong, determined, kind in ways that matter." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, seeing there all the certainty she felt in her own heart. "And I love you, Emmett, not despite your silver hair or the lines around your eyes, but because of them, because they tell the story of a man who has lived with integrity, who has endured loss without becoming hard, who sees value in what others overlook. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the meeting of two people who had learned to be cautious with their hearts. But beneath the gentleness lay a current of certainty, of rightness, that neither had expected to find when Martha's letter had set this unlikely journey in motion. When they finally parted, Emmett kept her hand in his, unwilling to break the connection entirely. "So," he said, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it. "No interest in the Miller place, then?" Katerina laughed, the sound carrying across the garden like music. "Perhaps we could look at it together. Not for me alone, but for our future. A place to expand the Sullivan holdings, to try new ideas. Our future," he repeated, the words seeming to satisfy something deep within him. "I like the sound of that." That evening, as the autumn sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across land that had weathered drought and legal battles, and was still standing, Emmett and Katerina sat on the porch with Martha and Daniel, planning not just the winter ahead, but years to come. No formal proposal was made that night, no ring offered or accepted. Such gestures seemed unnecessary for two people who had already pledged themselves to each other in all the ways that mattered. Their bond had been forged in adversity, strengthened by respect, deepened by understanding. Whatever name they gave it, partnership, companionship, love, it was real and enduring. And if the townsfolk of Milbrook still whispered about the mail-order bride who had been called too old at 28, their gossip held no power anymore. For Katerina had found what many spend lifetimes seeking, a place to belong, a purpose that fulfilled her, and a man whose silver hair and weathered hands offered not the last chance of a desperate woman, but the perfect match for a heart that had finally found its home. Spring arrived at Sullivan Ranch with a gentle persistence that mirrored the changes in the lives of those who called it home. The winter had been challenging, not from financial strain as Victor Caldwell had predicted, but from the natural rhythms of Montana seasons. Snow had blanketed the land for weeks at a time, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and new. For Katerina, who had never experienced such vast whiteness, each snowfall had been a revelation. Now, as tender green shoots pushed through the warming earth, the ranch itself seemed to breathe more easily. The creek ran full and clear, nourished by mountain snowmelt. In the north pasture, a small herd of sheep, Katerina's suggestion, grazed contentedly alongside the cattle. Their introduction had been controversial at first, with Emmett skeptical of the change to generations of ranching tradition. But seeing the hardy animals thrive on land too rocky for cattle had convinced him of the wisdom in diversification. The Miller property, purchased at auction for a surprisingly reasonable sum, had become their experiment in new beginnings. The small house had been renovated under Katerina's careful direction, its sagging porch replaced, windows reglazed, walls freshly whitewashed. Though they didn't live there, they often rode over to check on the young couple who managed it for them, a newlywed pair from town who had jumped at the chance to learn ranching under Emmett's tutelage. Daniel had settled into a routine of splitting his time between Sullivan Ranch and his law practice in town. The months following Caldwell's downfall had seen him gradually reconnect with the land of his childhood, rediscovering the satisfaction in physical labor and the quiet beauty that had once seemed like a prison to his younger self. His legal expertise had proven invaluable, as neighboring ranchers sought protection from business interests that might follow in Caldwell's footsteps. Martha, despite her protests that she was too old for new tricks, had taken to teaching a group of local women Katerina's methods of vegetable gardening and preservation. The drought had taught hard lessons about self-sufficiency, and Martha's kitchen had become a weekly gathering place where practical knowledge was exchanged alongside recipes and gossip. As for Katerina and Emmett, their relationship had deepened with the passing seasons in the quiet, steady way of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. No grand gestures marked their growing closeness, just the accumulation of small moments, hands brushing while passing tools in the barn, shared smiles across the dinner table, evening conversations that stretched long into the night. They had married in February, on a clear, cold day, when the mountains stood crisp against a perfect blue sky. The ceremony had been small, just family and close friends gathered in the ranch house parlor, while Judge Monroe, his stern face softened by the occasion, had pronounced them husband and wife. Daniel had stood as his father's best man, while Martha had sniffled proudly in the front row. Sheriff Green had brought his fiddle for dancing afterward, and the house had filled with warmth and laughter that seemed to chase away the last shadows of loneliness from its corners. Now, on a mild April morning, Katerina stood at the edge of her expanded garden, planning the season's planting. At 30, she felt more settled in her skin than she ever had at 28, when whispers of "too old" had followed her from her village. The Montana sun had touched her skin with a healthy glow, and work had strengthened her body in ways factory labor never had. If silver threads had begun to appear among the dark waves of her hair, she considered them badges of the life she had, chosen rather than marks of time's passage. "You're up early," Emmett said, coming up behind her. The months of marriage had not diminished the flutter in her chest when he appeared, his silver hair catching the morning light, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, leaning back against him as his arms encircled her waist. "Too many ideas for the garden. I want to try that new irrigation method Daniel read about in his agricultural journal." Emmett chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. "Always thinking ahead. That's why this place is thriving when half the ranches in the county are still struggling." It was true. Sullivan Ranch had not only survived, but begun to prosper in ways none of them had imagined possible a year ago. The combination of Emmett's deep knowledge of the land, Katerina's innovative approaches, Daniel's business acumen, and Martha's practical wisdom had transformed their operation. They now supplied not just beef to local markets, but lamb, wool, vegetables, and Katerina's specially preserved foods, which had developed something of a following among the merchants who traveled the railroad. "I've been thinking," Emmett said, his voice taking on the careful tone that meant he was about to suggest something he considered significant. "The upper meadow where the wildflowers grow, what would you think about building a cabin there?" Katerina turned in his arms, studying his face. "A cabin? For what purpose?" "For us, sometimes." He looked almost shy, this man who could face down Victor Caldwell without flinching. "A place that's just ours, away from the main house. Somewhere we could watch the sunrise without Martha bustling around the kitchen or Daniel coming in with legal papers." The suggestion touched Katerina deeply. The main house was home now, filled with warmth and family, but it held generations of Sullivan history that sometimes felt overwhelming. A small place that would be truly theirs, not inherited or adapted but created together, seemed like the perfect next step in their journey. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Could we have a porch that faces the mountains?" "Anything you want." He kissed her forehead gently. "You've given this old ranch new life, Katerina Sullivan. A cabin in the wildflower meadow seems a small thing in return." They might have lingered there, making plans in the morning sun, but Martha's voice called from the house, announcing that breakfast was ready and they'd better come while the biscuits were hot. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the home. They shared, both thinking of the small haven they would create in the meadow, another beginning in a life now full of them. Breakfast at Sullivan Ranch had evolved from the silent, perfunctory meal Katerina had first encountered to a lively family gathering. This morning, Daniel had ridden over early, bringing news from town, along with a stack of mail that included several orders for Katerina's preserved vegetables and a letter from the agricultural college expressing interest in Emmett's methods of drought-resistant ranching. "The railway station's getting an expansion," Daniel reported, helping himself to a second biscuit. "Agent says passenger traffic's increased enough to warrant a proper waiting room." "About time," Martha sniffed, pouring more coffee all around. "Disgraceful making folks wait in the weather, especially with all the new business coming through." Katerina smiled at the housekeeper's proprietary tone. In the months since the court case, Milbrook had begun to emerge from Caldwell's shadow, developing a modest prosperity based on legitimate business rather than one man's ambitions. The railway expansion was just the latest sign of the town's rebirth. "Speaking of new business," Daniel continued, "Eleanor Whitman stopped me yesterday, asking if you might consider supplying her store with more of those pickled beets. Said they're selling faster than she can stock them." Katerina raised an eyebrow, amused. Eleanor Whitman's transformation from leading gossip to enthusiastic business partner had been unexpected. The storekeeper, who had once called her that foreign gold digger, now sang the praises of Mrs. Sullivan's European preserves to anyone who would listen. "I'll put up another batch next week," Katerina agreed, "though she'll have to wait until the new beets are ready for the fresh ones." The conversation continued, plans and news flowing easily around the table. Emmett mentioned the cabin idea, earning immediate approval from Daniel, who offered to help with the construction, and a suspiciously damp-eyed blessing from Martha, who declared it high time you young folks had a place of your own. Young folks. Katerina savored the phrase, so different from what she'd been called just a year ago. Age, she had learned, was not about years, but about possibility, the ability to see new beginnings where others saw endings. After breakfast, Katerina headed to the root cellar to inventory their remaining preserves. The cool, earthy space had become her domain, its rough shelves now organized with military precision, jams and jellies on the upper levels, vegetables below, everything labeled in her neat handwriting with date and contents. She was counting. Jars of pickled cucumbers when she heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. Expecting Martha or Emmett, she was surprised to see a young woman she didn't recognize, perhaps 20, with wheat-colored hair and anxious eyes. "Mrs. Sullivan?" the girl asked hesitantly. "I'm sorry to disturb you. Mr. Sullivan, your husband, said I might find you here." Katerina set down her inventory list, wiping her hands on her apron. "You found me. How can I help you?" The young woman twisted her hands together nervously. "My name is Lucy Bennett. I've come from Minnesota in response to an advertisement." Understanding dawned. Lucy Bennett was a mail-order bride, one of several who had arrived in Milbrook in recent months as the town grew. Katerina felt an immediate kinship with this nervous young woman standing in her root cellar, memories of her own arrival still vivid. "Come upstairs where it's warmer," Katerina said gently. "We'll have tea and you can tell me why you're here, instead of meeting your intended." In the kitchen, over steaming cups of Martha's strong tea, Lucy's story emerged. She had traveled west to marry a rancher named Michael Collins, but upon arrival had discovered his property was little more than a tumble-down shack, his cattle operation a handful of sickly cows, and the man himself drunker than he had appeared in the single photograph he'd sent. "I couldn't stay," Lucy said, eyes downcast. "Not after I saw how things truly were. But now I'm here with no money to return home, and the ladies at church said perhaps you might understand my situation, being foreign-born yourself." Katerina sipped her tea, considering. It wasn't the first time a distressed bride had sought her advice since her marriage to Emmett had become something of a local success story. Usually, she could offer temporary work at the ranch until other arrangements could be made. But something about Lucy Bennett's straightforward manner and the steady hands that had stopped trembling once she began her story suggested a different approach. "The Miller place needs a housekeeper," Katerina said thoughtfully. "The young couple managing it are excellent with the animals, but neither knows the first thing about maintaining a proper home. And with lambing season approaching, they could use an extra set of hands." Lucy's face brightened with cautious hope. "I grew up on a farm, Mrs. Sullivan. I know about lambing, and I'm a good cook and housekeeper." "Then I think we may have a solution," Katerina smiled. "At least until you decide your next steps. And please, call me Katerina." By the time Emmett returned from the north pasture, Katerina had arranged for Lucy to stay the night before being taken to the Miller place in the morning. The young woman was already helping Martha prepare dinner, her sleeves rolled up and her earlier nervousness replaced by the confidence of someone engaged in familiar work. Emmett raised an eyebrow at Katerina as they stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Taking in strays now, are we?" There was no criticism in his tone, only the gentle teasing of a man who knew his wife's compassionate nature well. Katerina leaned against the porch railing, her shoulder brushing his. "She reminds me of myself a little," she admitted, "lost, far from home, facing choices no one should have to make alone. But she's stronger than she knows." "Like someone else I could name," Emmett replied, his hand finding hers. "You've changed things around here, Katerina, not just for me, but for the whole community. That girl in there isn't the first to seek you out, and I doubt she'll be the last." Katerina hadn't thought of it that way, but she realized he was right. Since standing up to Caldwell alongside Emmett, she had gradually become someone others looked to for guidance, particularly women facing difficult circumstances. Without intending to, she had created a small network of support that stretched from the ranch to town and beyond. "I only do what I wish someone had done for me," she said simply. Emmett's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And that's why I love you, Mrs. Sullivan. You take what life has taught you and use it to light the way for others." Inside, they could hear Martha laughing at something Lucy had said, the sound blending with the clatter of dinner preparations. Soon Daniel would arrive, bringing news from town and his infectious enthusiasm for whatever new agricultural innovation he'd read about. The house would fill with conversation and warmth. The family they had built one careful connection at a time. Later that night, as Emmett slept peacefully beside her, Katerina lay awake thinking of the cabin they would build in the wildflower meadow. She imagined its simple rooms filled with light, the porch where they would watch both sunrise and sunset, the garden she would plant around it, not for necessity but for beauty. Perhaps, she thought, they might add a second bedroom, not for guests, but for possibilities she had only recently allowed herself to consider. At 30, she was not too old for new dreams, new life. The doctor in town had confirmed as much. Just last week, though she hadn't yet found the right moment to share the news with Emmett, she placed a hand on her still flat stomach, thinking of the future growing within her, another beginning in a life now defined by them rather than endings. Tomorrow would be soon enough to tell him. For now, she savored the secret knowledge, adding it to the quiet joy that had become the foundation of her days. Spring continued to unfold across Sullivan Ranch, each day bringing new growth, new challenges, new rewards. The cabin in the meadow took shape board by board, room by room, Emmett and Daniel working together in the lengthening evenings, while Katerina planned the garden that would surround it. Lucy Bennett flourished at the Miller place, her competent management soon making it the most orderly operation on Sullivan land. By summer, she had developed a friendship with Thomas Green, the sheriff, making increasingly frequent visits to check on things at the outlying property. Martha declared herself too old for all this romance in the air, but watched with undisguised satisfaction as the family she had helped create continued to grow and strengthen. Her kitchen remained the heart of the ranch, though she had begun very gradually to yield territory to Katerina's expanding culinary experiments. The women's gardening circle that had begun in Martha's kitchen now met regularly, exchanging seeds, techniques, and community news. Under Katerina's quiet guidance, it had also become a place where women like Lucy could find support and practical help in creating lives of their own choosing. Word spread beyond Milbrook. Occasionally, letters arrived addressed simply to the mail-order bride who married the silver-haired rancher, asking for advice or encouragement from women facing similar journeys. Katerina answered each one. Her words simple but powerful. You are not too old. You're not too anything. You are exactly enough. In July, as wildflowers painted the meadow in a riot of color, the cabin was completed. Emmett insisted on carrying Katerina across the threshold in the traditional manner, though she protested that such gestures were for new brides, not women married for months. Indulge an old rancher's romantic streak, he'd said with a wink, that made him look years younger. Besides, it's a new home. That calls for traditions. Standing in the main room with its wide windows, framing mountain views, Katerina had felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find when she first set foot in Montana. The cabin was everything they had planned. Simple, beautiful, built with love and attention to detail. A home created not from obligation or convenience, but from choice and shared vision. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching twilight settle over the land that had become the foundation of their shared life, Katerina finally shared her news. Emmett's face had transformed with wonder, his weathered hands gentle as they rested on her stomach, feeling for the first time the slight swell that had begun to show. A child, he'd whispered, blue eyes bright with emotion. Our child. Are you pleased? She'd asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it nonetheless. Pleased doesn't begin to describe it. His voice had been rough with feeling. When you came here, I thought I was too old for new beginnings, too set in my ways for change. You've proven me wrong at every turn, Katerina Sullivan. They had stayed on the porch until the stars emerged, making plans, sharing dreams, savoring the miracle of finding in each other not what the world had told them to expect, but what they truly needed. The mail-order bride called too old at 28. The silver-haired rancher who thought his best years were behind him, both proven wonderfully, gloriously wrong. Autumn came again to Sullivan Ranch, painting the aspen groves gold against the evergreens. The harvest was abundant, the preserves plentiful, the livestock healthy and multiplying. In the meadow cabin, Katerina moved with the new grace of impending motherhood, her body changing as the child within grew stronger. Emmett watched her with constant amazement, this woman who had transformed not just his ranch, but his entire conception of what life could hold. Her age, once deemed a liability, by those who couldn't see her true worth, now seemed the perfect complement to his own. She had lived enough to know her mind, to stand firm in her convictions, to recognize value where others saw only flaws. On the anniversary of her arrival, they held a harvest celebration at the ranch house. Neighbors and friends gathered to share food, music, and the particular camaraderie that develops among people who have weathered hardship together. Sheriff Green played his fiddle, while Daniel, much to everyone's surprise, revealed a fine singing voice. Martha presided over the kitchen with benevolent authority, directing her corps of assistants with the precision of a general. As twilight gathered, Emmett found Katerina sitting on the porch steps, watching the celebration with contentment. He lowered himself beside her, knees creaking slightly, and took her hand in his. Happy? he asked simply. She nodded, leaning against his shoulder. More than I knew was possible. They sat in comfortable silence, observing the joyful scene before them, Martha teaching Lucy a traditional dance, while Thomas Green looked on admiringly. Daniel deep in conversation with the young couple from the Miller place, neighbors and townspeople mingling easily, the divisions of the past giving way to new connections. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Martha hadn't sent that letter?" Emmett asked. "If you hadn't been brave enough to travel across the world, to a place you'd never seen? If I hadn't been stubborn enough to fight for this land?" Katerina considered the question, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their child moved with increasing purpose. "I think perhaps we would have found each other anyway," she said finally. "Some things are meant to be, even if the path isn't straight." Emmett smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine happiness. "A romantic notion from my practical wife? Pregnancy must be softening your outlook." She laughed, the sound blending with the music and conversation flowing around them. "Not softening, expanding. Like everything else in this life we've built, there's always room for more than we imagine possible." As the stars emerged above Sullivan Ranch, Katerina thought of all the women who had been told they were too something, too old, too stubborn, too different, and all the men who had been dismissed as too set in their ways for new beginnings. If her story could give hope to even one of them, then the journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this life full of unexpected joy, had an even greater purpose than she had known. In the gathering darkness, with her husband's solid presence beside her and their child growing within, Katerina Sullivan, once a mail-order bride deemed too old at 28, now a woman who had found in that supposed liability her greatest strength, watched the celebration continue and gave silent thanks for second chances, for silver-haired ranchers who saw beyond appearances, and for the courage to believe that it's never too late to find where you truly belong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.